So we're really excited because we are getting into the first part of launching a clinical trial site. Edie, we talked a little bit before we got on about what steps to take in terms of registrations. What are you thinking about if you have a new clinical trial site? What registrations do you need?
I actually am gonna go state first. So things like informed consent, that's always regulated actually at the state level. And what counts as a legally authorized representative, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this could be different in terms of priority depending on what state you're in. You may look at the state law and go, yeah, there's really not anything over the top here. I'm pretty close to federal regulation in my state. I can sort of check this box and move on. But there are plenty of states, I love you, California and Texas, that have some very specific state laws that may be game changers in terms of how you're even going to register your organization, infrastructure-wise, set it up, organize it, et cetera. I just want to know that off the top. Where would you go first?
I would actually start off with on the corporate practice of medicine. Texas, for example. Texas specifically calls out and says, you know what? Clinical research is part of the practice of medicine. If it's part of the practice of medicine, are you allowed to actually, as a non-physician, own a practice that does clinical research? Or does the doctor own the doctor's office? You own the portion that does the actual research elements, and that makes it easier to sell later on. It's very simple to do. It's very simple setup, and it works across most states. If you decide to do a simpler structure, which is you own all of it, some states simply don't allow that, so you have to keep that in mind. The reason Edie and I disagree on this one is how likely is it that someone's going to come after you? I operate from the, you know what, it's a low risk, but I'm not taking that risk. Edie's like, I work off of risk-based structure, and to me, that's more important.
The point is having the information. The point is knowing what the risk is before you make the call. If you're in Texas and you do have this state law and you go, I'm on Edie's camp, I'm gonna roll the dice. Great, but you did it with that knowledge, right? We wouldn't want you to not know that information versus a state like Indiana where we don't have a rule like that. And so for me, that's genuinely not a concern. Some states there's just like not anything I'm worried about almost. And then there's some states where there's like a litany of we got to talk about this before you even go into business. But I think this is the area that trips most people up more than, oh, I have to comply with the FDA. What are the chances you opened a clinical trial site and didn't think the FDA was going to be on your radar? Like,
The other thing I'm going to talk about is telemedicine, because a lot of
yep,
we keep talking about decentralized clinical trials.
yep.
What you do need to think about is how many of your patients are you going to see virtually, and how is that going to play out? It's not as simple as, oh, I'm just going to use Zoom, because if you do, you might be exposing yourself to liability because Zoom has certain structures that allow it, but you need to have your own policies, procedures, etc.
And you also need to understand what therapeutic areas you can use it. Like we were just discussing the differences between behavioral health and psychiatry versus other therapeutic areas where telehealth may be regulated separate even within your state. And so understanding as a practitioner what you're allowed. I also think it's really important to understand, and I'm not saying you can always adhere to every best practice. No one has all the resources to be 100% compliant. What I do think is important for a physician practice is to at least know what the gold standard is. It doesn't mean you can achieve it, but you don't only want to know the floor. You want to know the ceiling too. And you can decide based on the individual customized characteristics of your practice and your therapeutic area and your patients and your long-term goals and desires if you do want to become acquired one day or not.
Do you need to get insurance? What kind of insurance do you need to get? Because a lot of physicians I know will come out and say, oh, I already have insurance. No, you have insurance for your medical practice. Sometimes your insurance will carve out clinical research, and sometimes insurance will not carve out. And you need to know what your insurance does. I think that's a really important part.
As kind of an addition to that, what the different licenses or certifications of your staff allow for them to do and not do as a part of the bridge from clinical care into research. Because again, sometimes you do have state laws or licensing-based accreditation laws that say, you must have this accreditation to be able to interact with the patient from a state perspective. I think that's the other piece of that is like not only thinking about insurance, but thinking about what is everyone officially licensed to do.
In 2025, the big element we're thinking about is artificial intelligence. I'm seeing physicians come out and say this, oh, I'm going to use AI to actually act as a scribe for me to summarize my notes. Is that allowed? Is that a HIPAA violation? Are you allowed to get a consent or a waiver for that?
Right.
Maybe state specific. Think about whether that applies in your state, whether it applies to you. Again, thinking about telehealth, telemedicine, are you allowed to waive the first visit? Because depending on where you are, they may require that you still have the first visit in person. And that's going to be state specific. Keep that in mind.
Sometimes even therapeutic area specific, where even after you've been seen the first time to get certain refills on certain types of medications because of the disorder or the elements that are being treated, your state says, look, you have to be seen every X amount of cadence, right? And that's a state licensing law for that position. And that's going to interplay into a part of that practice, 100%. You got to be aware of what that is.
And I love how we're sort of going back and forth in these because we have
Probably giving the audience like 8,000 reasons not to start our research site. Like, we're not trying to scare you. We just want you to think of everything so that you don't get halfway in and then go.
What you also have to find out is, again, if you're using telehealth, but even if you're not using telehealth, you may have a patient be referred to you. Multiple states do require that you actually get the patient's history before you start taking the patient on. In those scenarios, you need to have the consent forms for that. Make sure you have the patient history for that. You might not be able to have your telehealth visit without that information in place. You may need to get consent for them to use your patient portals. Make sure you have that in place.
What you're starting to think of is really having almost like I don't want to simplify it, but like a package that has to occur, like the feasibility checklist, right? Like we referred to in our launching a site video, and some of that is business feasibility. Like, do I have the funding? You know, how do I even register my organization in my state, et cetera? And then you dive into those categories, and then the next juncture is like, when am I ready to see my first patient? Right? When am I ready to actually execute a study visit or go to a study sponsor and say, like, I am prepared to do this logistically? And that's at the whole next step, because that's where you got to have, the privacy and the consent and the entire process by which it's going to happen. Everyone's going to have be trained, GCP, HIPAA. If you're working in GDPR, like there's a huge step between opening the actual front door and allowing a patient in the front door, right? And I think of those as two very big steps that have to happen.
On that note, Edie, thank you for coming on. This was amazing.
Always.